She never imagined herself on a military range, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air and the sound of gunfire echoing off the surrounding hills, yet here she was, in the middle of it all, wearing oversized ear protection and holding a bundle of paper targets that flapped lightly in the dry wind. She had come as a volunteer helper for the training exercise, nothing more than an extra pair of hands to replace torn targets, carry clips of paper and keep the firing line clean, but already she felt small and out of place among the hardened men and women of the unit. They moved with precision, their boots digging into the ground with steady force, their weapons handled with a familiarity that spoke of years of practice. She kept her eyes lowered most of the time, trying not to get in the way, trying to ignore the way some of them glanced at her curiously, perhaps wondering why someone like her had signed up to assist. The only thing that comforted her was the routine: walk out when the whistle blew, pull down the shredded paper, replace it with a fresh target, and then quickly retreat behind the line before the next round began. It was simple, safe work, and she told herself that if she stayed invisible, the hours would pass quickly and she could leave without anyone remembering her name. But then he noticed her. He stood apart from the others, not because he tried to, but because everything about him carried an unmistakable authority. The others called him Chief, and sometimes Seal, their voices laced with respect, and it wasn't long before she pieced together who he was: a Navy SEAL, one of the few brought in to demonstrate advanced drills for the recruits. He was broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and had eyes that seemed to measure everything at once. Unlike the rest, he didn't waste energy on chatter. He checked his gear, fired with terrifying precision, then stepped back to watch others, saying little but making every word land. She tried not to look at him, but somehow she kept noticing his presence, the calm way he held his rifle, the way silence fell when he shifted his stance. To her, he looked like the embodiment of everything she wasn't: disciplined, fearless, carved by years of hard living. She assumed he hadn't noticed her at all. Why would he? She was just the girl fixing paper targets, a shadow on the edges of the range. That illusion shattered during a break. The line went quiet, weapons lowered, safety protocols enforced. She had just finished pinning up a fresh round of targets when she felt someone approach. She turned and almost dropped her stapler when she saw him standing there, the SEAL himself, close enough that she could see the tiny scars along his jaw. He held his rifle loosely in one hand as if it were nothing more than a walking stick, though she knew it was heavy and lethal. For a heartbeat she thought he was going to ask her to move aside, maybe scold her for being too slow, but instead he tilted his head and said, "Ever fired one?" She blinked, stunned, unable to form words. "A gun," he clarified, his voice low, steady, not mocking but genuinely curious. She shook her head quickly, embarrassed, and muttered something about not belonging here. He studied her for a long second, then without a word, he extended the rifle toward her, holding it across both hands like an offering. "Then today's the day," he said simply. Her throat went dry. The rifle looked impossibly large, black metal gleaming in the sunlight. She stammered something about not being allowed, about just being there to fix targets, but he only stepped closer, set the safety on with a practiced flick, and pressed the weapon gently into her hands. It was heavier than she expected, dragging at her arms, but the warmth of his grip lingered on the metal, steadying her. She looked up at him in panic, hoping he would take it back, but instead he stepped behind her, one hand raised as if giving space. Feet apart. Shoulders square. Breathe. His voice was patient, quiet, a tone she hadn't heard him use with anyone else. Around them, a few recruits paused to watch, but nobody interrupted. Something about the moment felt suspended, as though the air itself held its breath. Her hands shook as she adjusted her stance, trying to follow his instructions. The rifle dug into her shoulder awkwardly, and she thought she must look ridiculous, a clumsy beginner among professionals. She whispered that she couldn't do it, that she'd make a fool of herself, but he leaned closer and said, "You don't have to hit the bullseye. You just have to try." His words struck her harder than the sound of any gunfire. It wasn't a challenge, but an invitation. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them, fixed her gaze on the distant target, and forced herself to breathe in slow, even rhythm like he said. The rifle felt less like an alien object and more like something that could be guided if only she trusted herself. Behind her, she sensed his steady presence, not pushing, not mocking, simply watching with the calm certainty that she could do this. The range was silent except for the thud of her heartbeat, and for the first time since arriving that morning, she forgot she was invisible. She forgot she was just the girl fixing targets. She was holding the weapon of a Navy SEAL, and he had stepped back to see what she would do. Her finger hovered just above the trigger, trembling with the weight of the moment, and for a heartbeat she considered lowering the rifle and handing it back, but something in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't judging, he wasn't demanding perfection, he was simply there, calm and steady, a wall of silent assurance telling her she could do this. She took another breath, adjusted her stance as he had shown her, and slowly let her finger settle against the trigger. The world seemed to narrow into a tunnel, the range, the target, the sight at the end of the barrel, and then with one small squeeze the rifle roared to life. The recoil kicked into her shoulder harder than she expected, jarring her entire body, but she held on, her teeth clenched, her eyes straining to keep focus. Smoke curled from the barrel and the echo of the shot rolled away into the distance. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She had fired her first round. She didn't dare look at the target, afraid of what she might see, afraid of failing in front of him, but then she heard a murmur of voices and the faint ripple of approval from the onlookers. She lowered the rifle just enough to glance, and her breath caught in disbelief. The bullet had landed close to the center, not perfect but far better than she had imagined. She turned her head slightly wide-eyed, but he only gave the smallest of nods as if to say, "There you see?" He stepped closer again, his hand brushing lightly against the stock as he adjusted her grip. "Not bad." "Again," he said simply, his tone still calm but carrying a subtle command that made her spine straighten. She nodded nervously and reset her stance. This time she remembered his advice, feet planted, shoulders square, breathe, don't rush. She fired again and again the rifle bucked, but it didn't feel as alien now. The sound no longer startled her as much. The weight in her hands felt like something she could learn to master. Another round struck the paper target, not quite as close to the center but still solid, and she heard someone whistle softly behind them. The SEAL ignored the noise. He leaned just enough for his voice to carry into her ear. "Don't chase the bullseye. Build the rhythm. Focus on control." She swallowed hard, nodding, and lifted the weapon for another shot. She fired, adjusted, fired again, the rhythm starting to form, the recoil less jarring with each round, until at last the rifle clicked empty. Her shoulders burned, her arms ached, but her chest swelled with a strange, unexpected pride. She had done it. She had held her ground and fired, and for a fleeting second she felt like maybe she belonged there after all. When she lowered the weapon, he reached out and took it gently from her hands, checking it with practiced motions before slinging it back over his shoulder. He studied her face, his gaze steady but unreadable. She opened her mouth to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. He gave another small nod, a trace of something like approval in his eyes, and said only, "Not afraid anymore, are you?" She blinked, realizing that the fear which had knotted her stomach earlier had vanished, replaced by adrenaline and something far more powerful, confidence. She shook her head slowly, still catching her breath. He looked satisfied, then stepped back again, his presence easing away, but not before she noticed the faintest curve of a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. It wasn't patronizing or mocking, it was quiet recognition, the kind given from one who had seen countless recruits stumble and rise again. She had earned it even if just for a moment. The others returned to their drills, but the air still hummed with the significance of what had just happened. She felt their glances linger on her, some surprised, some impressed, others simply curious. She didn't know what to do with the sudden attention, so she busied herself with gathering spent casings, pretending not to notice, but her heart wouldn't slow down. Every time she replayed the recoil of the rifle in her mind, she felt that rush again, the spark of power she had never touched before. She was still the volunteer, still the girl fixing targets, yet something inside had shifted. She caught herself stealing another look at him where he stood with his team, his rifle at rest, his eyes sharp as ever. He hadn't said much, hadn't needed to, but he had changed everything with a simple act, placing his weapon in her hands and trusting her to try. When the whistle blew again, signaling the next round of live fire, she stepped back to the sidelines, returning to her role, but nothing felt the same anymore. The crack of rifles no longer made her flinch, the distant targets no longer looked like something untouchable. Instead, she found herself imagining the sight, the squeeze, the kick against her shoulder. She imagined control. And every time the chief moved, issuing commands, demonstrating drills with lethal grace, she felt a strange pull inside, not of fear or intimidation, but of respect mixed with an almost childlike desire to prove herself further. She didn't know why he had chosen her, why he had handed her that weapon in the first place, but the thought gnawed at her with every passing minute. Maybe he had seen something she didn't. Maybe he believed she was capable of more than being invisible. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the range, she had replaced a dozen more targets, her fingers stained with dust and paper fibers. Her body was tired, but her mind burned with restless energy. She kept recalling his words, the calm certainty in his voice, the weight of his trust. When the range finally fell quiet and the recruits packed up, she lingered, unsure whether to slip away quietly or wait. He was still there, checking his gear, his movements precise and unhurried. She almost left, but then he looked up, his gaze locking onto hers across the dusty field, and in that silent exchange she understood that this wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She thought she could slip away quietly when the last of the recruits dispersed, but his voice cut through the cooling evening air, steady and firm. "Stay a minute." She froze, her hands halfway through packing the discarded targets into a bundle. Slowly she turned, uncertain, but he was already walking toward her, his stride purposeful yet unhurried. The rifle was slung across his chest, his gear loosened, but the aura of command still clung to him. She swallowed hard, unsure what he wanted, but obeyed, setting the bundle down and waiting. When he reached her, he stopped only a few feet away and studied her with the same measuring gaze he had given earlier. "You did well today," he said at last, his voice low, carrying weight without needing volume. She blinked, surprised by the praise, but before she could respond he added, "But firing one line isn't enough. Anybody can get lucky once. The question is whether you can do it again under pressure." Her pulse quickened, nerves tangling in her chest. "Pressure?" she repeated softly. He gave a small nod, then gestured toward the range. "The sun's low, the light is poor, your arms are tired. That's pressure. If you can focus now when everything tells you to quit, then maybe there's more to you than you think." His words struck deep, stirring something she hadn't known she carried. A mixture of fear and excitement flickered inside her. He was offering her another chance, not as a helper, not as a shadow, but as a participant. Slowly, almost against her own doubt, she nodded. He unslung the rifle again, checked it swiftly, and handed it back to her with the same deliberate motion as before. This time, her hands closed around it more firmly, less hesitant, though her arms still ached from earlier. He didn't step back immediately. Instead, he moved to her side, adjusting her stance with quick, precise touches. Her elbow lifted, her feet shifted an inch, her cheek pressed closer to the stock. "The weapon doesn't forgive sloppiness," he murmured. "It magnifies it. Respect it or it will own you." She nodded, biting her lip, absorbing every detail. When he stepped back, the distance felt both terrifying and freeing. She raised the rifle, sighted down the range, and waited for his signal. "Target 3, he called. She exhaled slowly, focused, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the air, and the target quivered with a fresh hole just off center. Her chest tightened with a rush of triumph. She had hit it, not perfectly but solidly. Before she could savor it, his voice came again, sharper this time. "Target 6. She jerked the rifle to the far side, struggled to realign, fired again. The round punched the outer ring. "Target 2. His commands came faster now, each one forcing her to swing the heavy weapon, adjust, breathe, and fire in seconds. Sweat prickled her skin, her arms screaming with fatigue, but she obeyed, shot after shot, until the magazine ran dry. Her breaths came ragged, her shoulders sagging, but the targets bore proof. Some hits clean, others messy, but none wasted entirely. He walked past her without a word, striding downrange to inspect. She watched him, her heart hammering, unsure if she had failed or impressed. He examined each target with careful eyes, then turned back, his expression unreadable. When he stopped before her again, he let the silence hang until she almost broke under it. Then he spoke. "You fought for every round. That matters more than a perfect circle." Relief washed over her so hard she nearly laughed, but she held it in, standing straighter instead. He studied her another moment, then asked quietly, "Why are you here?" The question startled her. She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing she didn't have an easy answer. She hadn't joined the volunteer group out of any grand plan. She had come because she wanted to be useful, because she wanted to step out of her ordinary life for once. But under his gaze those words felt small. I wanted to see if I could belong somewhere different," she admitted at last, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in disapproval but in consideration. "Belonging isn't given," he said. "It's earned. Today you started earning it." She held his words close, clutching them like a secret medal, even as exhaustion pulled at her body. He slung the rifle back over his shoulder, the conversation apparently finished, and began walking toward the equipment shed. She hesitated, then hurried to catch up, unsure if she was overstepping. He glanced at her briefly but didn't tell her to leave, so she walked beside him in silence, the fading sun painting the ground gold and orange. For the first time all day she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and more than that, she felt challenged. As they reached the shed, he paused at the door and finally looked at her fully, the steel in his eyes softened by a trace of curiosity. "Be here tomorrow," he said. "Before the others." Her breath caught, but she nodded quickly, almost afraid the chance would vanish if she hesitated. He gave a final nod and stepped inside, leaving her outside with her heart racing and a fire in her chest that hadn't been there that morning. That night, long after she returned home, she lay awake replaying everything: the weight of the rifle, the recoil, his voice steady in her ear, the relentless commands that had pushed her past her limits. She thought about the question he had asked, why she was there, and realized she still didn't fully know. But she did know one thing: she wanted to return. Not because of the thrill of shooting, not even because of the approval she had glimpsed in his eyes, but because for the first time in a long while she had felt alive, her fear burned away by focus, her doubts silenced by action. She turned onto her side, clutching the memory close, and whispered into the darkness, "I'll be there." The next morning the range was still cloaked in pale mist when she arrived, her breath visible in the cool air, her stomach tight with nerves. She had barely slept, her thoughts consumed by his command to be early, and now that she stood there, hands shoved in her pockets, she wondered if she had misunderstood. The place was empty, silent except for the distant rustle of wind through dry grass. For a moment she thought she had been foolish, that he wouldn't come, that maybe it had been nothing more than an offhand remark. But then she heard the crunch of boots on gravel and turned to see him approaching, his figure emerging from the haze like something carved from the earth itself. He carried no weapon this time, just a small duffel slung over his shoulder, his movements steady and sure. Her chest tightened as he stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring her resolve. "You came," he said simply. She nodded quickly, trying to appear steadier than she felt. He studied her for a moment longer, then dropped the bag at his feet and unzipped it. Inside lay gear: ear protection, safety glasses, spare magazines, even a smaller rifle than the one she had handled yesterday. He pulled it out and held it up, the morning light glinting along its surface. "This is yours for today. Lighter, easier to control. But don't mistake easier for simple. It will still punish mistakes." He handed it to her, and she accepted it with both hands, surprised at how natural the gesture felt this time. The weight still grounded her, but it didn't crush her as it had before. Without wasting time, he led her to the line and began to speak in the same calm, deliberate tone she had come to recognize. "Yesterday was instinct. Today will be discipline. You're going to learn to build consistency, not luck." He showed her how to load the magazine properly, his fingers moving with practiced speed, then had her mimic the motions until she could do it without fumbling. He corrected her grip, her posture, even the way she rested her cheek against the stock. Every adjustment was small, but each one brought her closer to control. When she fired her first shot, the recoil still jarred her, but it didn't throw her off balance, and when she fired again her grouping tightened. He nodded faintly, offering no lavish praise but enough to let her know she was improving. She found herself craving that nod, working harder for each one, sweat trickling down her back even as the morning grew colder. He pushed her relentlessly, giving her short, sharp commands that allowed no room for hesitation. "Reset. Again. Faster. Don't blink. Breathe steady." Each word cut through her doubts, anchoring her when her arms trembled and her shoulders screamed for rest. Hours passed and the mist burned away into bright sunlight. Her body ached, but she refused to quit, not with his eyes on her. She lost count of how many rounds she fired, how many times she reloaded, how many times he made her reset and start again. By midday, her fingers were raw from handling the magazines, and her ears rang despite the protection. But when she looked at the targets lined up in front of her, she felt a surge of pride. The holes weren't scattered anymore. They clustered in tighter groups, some nearly touching. She had never thought herself capable of such precision. He walked down the line, inspecting silently, then turned back and gave the faintest tilt of his head. It was more than approval, it was acknowledgement. She had earned it. She straightened under his gaze, exhausted but unwilling to show weakness. "Not bad," he said at last. "But you're still slow. In the field, hesitation kills. We'll work on that." His words weren't harsh, but they carried weight, and she felt them sink deep, igniting a determination she hadn't known she had. They took a short break, sitting on overturned crates near the shed. He drank water from a canteen, then offered it to her. She accepted gratefully, the cool liquid washing down the dust in her throat. For a few minutes they sat in silence, the only sound the occasional call of a distant bird. Finally she found the courage to speak. "Why me?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he did turn, his eyes were sharp but not unkind. "Because you were invisible," he said. "And people who think they're invisible often surprise themselves when given a chance." His words struck her deeply and she lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. He continued after a pause, his tone quieter. "Most people chase recognition. But you were content to be nothing more than a shadow on the edge. That told me you were worth testing." She felt her cheeks warm, a mix of embarrassment and gratitude rising in her chest. She had never thought of herself that way, but hearing it from him made her believe it might be true. When the break ended, he didn't go easy on her. He set up moving drills, forcing her to fire while shifting her stance, teaching her how to adjust on the run, how to keep her breathing steady even when her heart pounded. She stumbled more than once, nearly dropping the rifle, but each time he corrected her sharply and made her try again. By the time the sun leaned westward, her legs were as sore as her arms and she was drenched in sweat. Yet despite the exhaustion she felt stronger, sharper, more awake than she ever had. When he finally called a halt, she lowered the weapon with trembling hands, her body shaking but her spirit soaring. He approached, took the rifle from her gently and checked it. Then he looked at her and said, "You lasted longer than some recruits I've had." The pride that swelled in her chest nearly overwhelmed her. She managed a tired smile, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'll do better tomorrow." He studied her for a moment, then gave one firm nod. "Tomorrow then." As he turned away, she realized with a start that she wanted nothing more than to prove him right. The next day she arrived even earlier, the sky still streaked with faint gray before dawn, and for a few moments she was the only soul on the range. She stood quietly, inhaling the cool air, feeling the weight of anticipation press against her ribs. When his silhouette appeared at the far end of the path, moving with the same unhurried confidence as always, she felt her chest tighten in both nerves and excitement. He gave her a curt nod of acknowledgement, not wasting words, then set his gear down and began pulling out equipment she hadn't seen before. There were cones for marking positions, a heavier vest, and even a timer clipped to his belt. She watched curiously as he laid everything out with precision, and when he finally turned to her, his expression was firm, his tone measured. "You've shown you can shoot. Now we see if you can think under pressure." Her throat went dry, but she nodded without hesitation. He tossed her the vest and she nearly stumbled under its weight when she caught it. "Put it on," he ordered. She obeyed, adjusting the straps until it fit snugly, its weight pressing into her shoulders. It was heavier than she expected, and she realized he was already testing her before they even began. He set up the cones in staggered lines across the range, then placed fresh targets at varying distances. When everything was ready, he explained the drill. "You'll move between cones, drop to a knee, fire 2 rounds, move again, fire 2 more. I'll call targets out of order. You'll have seconds to react. Miss and you run the line again. Understand?" She swallowed hard and nodded. He studied her for a moment, then handed her the rifle she had used yesterday, already loaded. "Don't think. Just listen. Trust the training." The timer beeped and his voice snapped through the morning air. "Target 5. She rushed to the first cone, dropped to a knee, aimed and fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder but the shot was good. "Target 2. She scrambled to the next cone, her legs heavy under the vest, her breath ragged. She fired again, slightly wide, and heard his voice call sharply, "Faster. Focus." The commands came relentlessly, each one pushing her harder. She stumbled, missed once, cursed under her breath, then forced herself to reset. The timer beeped at the end and she collapsed to a knee, sweat dripping into her eyes. He walked over, glanced at the targets and gave a short nod. Again. Her heart sank, but she forced herself back to her feet. The second run was harder. Her arms ached, her lungs burned, but something inside her refused to give up. She pushed herself to move faster, to aim sharper, hearing his commands as if they were carved into her bones. "Target 3. Target 7. Target 1. The rifle felt heavier with each shot, but she held on, teeth clenched, fighting past the tremors in her hands. By the time the timer beeped again, she was gasping, her body screaming for rest, yet she realized with shock that her grouping had tightened. She had improved even under pressure. He inspected silently, then turned to her. "Better. But you still hesitate between shots. Don't think. React." His words cut deep, but she took them like fuel, determination hardening in her chest. She wanted more. She wanted to prove him wrong about hesitation. "Again," she said hoarsely, surprising even herself. His brows lifted faintly, But then he gave the smallest nod, reset the timer and stepped back. They repeated the drill again and again until her legs wobbled beneath her and the vest felt like it was crushing her into the ground. She lost count of how many times she sprinted between cones, how many times she dropped to a knee and fired, how many times he barked corrections. Yet with each run, something inside her sharpened. The fear that had once clouded her mind was gone. All that remained was focus, raw and unyielding. When she finally stumbled at the end of a run, nearly dropping the rifle, he caught her arm and steadied her, his grip firm but not unkind. "That's enough," he said, his voice quieter now. She wanted to argue, to beg for one more round, but the exhaustion was too deep and she could only nod. He guided her back to the crates near the shed, where she collapsed onto the wood, her chest heaving. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply stood there watching her catch her breath. Finally he said, "You learn fast. Faster than I expected." Her heart leapt at the words, though she kept her expression steady. "But," he added, "learning to fight isn't just about speed or aim. It's about what you do when fear comes back. Because it always does." She met his gaze, sweat dripping down her temples, and whispered, "Then teach me how to face it." His eyes narrowed, searching her face, and after a long pause he gave one sharp nod. "Tomorrow we start with scenarios." That night, her muscles throbbed and her body begged for rest, but her mind refused to quiet. She replayed every command, every mistake, every hit. She saw the targets in her dreams, saw his steady eyes, heard his voice pushing her harder than she thought possible. And through it all, she realized something had changed inside her. She wasn't just chasing the pride of hitting a bullseye anymore. She was chasing something deeper: discipline, strength, a version of herself she had never imagined existed. She wanted to see how far she could go, even if it broke her, because for the first time she wasn't afraid of being invisible. She was afraid of never trying. Under the heavy warmth of the midday sun, the training field seemed to pulse with life, alive with the thunder of gunfire and the clatter of shells raining against the dusty ground. Evelyn stood near the far edge of the firing line, her task simple yet essential: resetting targets, clearing debris and maintaining order for the steady rhythm of drills. She had grown accustomed to the symphony of discipline that surrounded her each day, the barking of commands, the synchronized movements of the recruits, and the relentless precision demanded by the Navy SEAL instructors. She wasn't supposed to be a participant, just a pair of watchful hands keeping the range ready for use. But ever since that moment when one of the SEALs, an intense and confident man named Cole, had placed a rifle in her hands and stepped back, insisting she take a shot, everything had shifted. The memory of that single act still lingered in her bones, stirring a mixture of adrenaline, fear, and something harder to name. From then on, Cole had taken an interest in her presence, watching her not with the distant tolerance of a soldier toward a civilian but with the calculating eye of someone who saw potential waiting to be drawn out. At first she resisted his offers. When he pressed her to try again, she brushed him off, hiding behind her duties, insisting she had no place in their world. But Cole wasn't the kind to let things go. He began with small challenges, informal competitions set up when no one else was watching. He would hand her an unloaded pistol, instructing her on how to clear it, and refused to take it back until she executed each movement flawlessly. He made her carry heavy equipment across the range, showing her how to balance her body under weight. Every small test was wrapped in his quiet persistence, and every time she rose to meet them, something in her shifted. She was beginning to sense that he was not training her just for amusement but because he truly believed she could handle more than she gave herself credit for. The other SEALs began to notice too. At first, they mocked Cole for wasting his energy on what they considered a distraction: a range assistant with no military background, no scars to prove she belonged. But as the days went on, their skepticism turned into curiosity. Evelyn, who had once been invisible, became the subject of sidelong glances. When she picked up a weapon under Cole's instruction, her stance clumsy but determined, more than one SEAL paused mid-drill to watch. She felt their eyes on her, and though it made her nervous, it also lit a strange kind of fire in her. It was no longer just about humoring Cole. She wanted to prove herself. She wanted to show them she wasn't fragile, that she could stand in their world if only for a moment. Her first breakthrough came one afternoon when the sun was sinking low and the range glowed with the fading light. Cole had set up a single steel plate at a distance she knew was beyond her skill. He handed her the rifle, adjusted her stance and whispered, "Trust yourself. Breathe. Squeeze, don't jerk." She doubted, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might throw her off, but when she pulled the trigger, the crack of the shot was followed by the sweet, ringing sound of impact. The plate shuddered and she froze, scarcely believing what she had done. The other SEALs, who had been idly watching, broke into a chorus of whistles and surprised laughter. Cole just gave a slow nod, the barest of smiles tugging at his lips, as if he had known all along she would hit her mark. That sound, the metallic ping of success, stayed with her through the night. It was the moment she stopped seeing herself as an outsider. The training deepened after that. Cole was relentless but fair, always pushing, never coddling. He taught her to reload under pressure, to shift targets with speed, to clear jams with calm hands. He even made her run time drills alongside the men, her lungs burning, her legs trembling, but her determination unbroken. Sometimes she failed spectacularly, missing every shot or fumbling with equipment until her cheeks burned with frustration. But Cole never let her sink into self-doubt. "Failure's part of it," he would say evenly, his voice carrying that unshakable conviction. "You learn, you adjust, you come back stronger." Slowly she began to see what he meant. Each mistake was a stepping stone, each error a lesson written in sweat and grit. What surprised her most wasn't just her growing skill with the weapons, but the way she started to carry herself off the range. She stood taller, walked with more certainty, and no longer shrank when the SEALs barked or joked around her. They began to treat her differently too, no longer the outsider fixing targets but a comrade in training, someone who was proving herself with every long day. The walls she had once placed around herself began to crack. She found herself laughing with them during breaks, trading banter, feeling included in a world she once thought closed to her. But more than that, she felt alive. Each day ended with exhaustion, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came with purpose, with knowing she was building something new inside herself. Cole noticed it too. Though he rarely said much, his eyes betrayed the satisfaction he took in her progress. One evening, after an especially grueling set of drills, he lingered while she packed up the equipment. "You're not the same person who first picked up that rifle," he said simply. She looked at him, trying to find words, but all she managed was a quiet nod. Because he was right. Something inside her had shifted, and there was no going back. What began as a single, impulsive act, him placing that weapon in her hands, had grown into something she hadn't imagined, a transformation. The range had become more than a place of noise and dust. It had become the crucible where she was forging a version of herself she never thought possible. And as the stars began to spread across the sky, Evelyn realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of failure, not of the weapons, not of the judgments around her. With Cole's guidance and her own grit, she was stepping into something larger, something that demanded every ounce of strength she had. The journey was only beginning, and though she couldn't yet see where it would lead, she knew she was ready to face it head-on. The revelation and the turning point, the day that followed, was unlike any other. The air itself seemed charged with an invisible current, as though the heavens were preparing to unveil a truth long buried beneath layers of secrecy and misdirection. The town had gathered once again, their faces painted with a mix of expectation, exhaustion, and an insatiable hunger for answers. Marina stood tall at the center, her eyes sharper than ever, and the HOA representatives who once strutted with arrogance now fidgeted like cornered animals awaiting judgment. For weeks, the people had endured chaos, demands, and threats, but now the tide was about to turn in their favor. As the crowd quieted, Marina began to speak, her voice steady and commanding, echoing across the gathering. "For too long," she declared, "we have been told lies, coerced by rules that were never meant for us, and threatened with authority that was never theirs to wield. Today I will show you the truth, unfiltered, undeniable, and irreversible." With a deliberate motion, she revealed a collection of files, letters, and records she had spent countless sleepless nights piecing together. The documents contained evidence that the HOA had fabricated ownership rights, tampered with boundary lines, and even conspired with outside developers to secure personal gain at the expense of the community's freedom. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire, eyes widening as pages passed from hand to hand, the weight of betrayal sinking deeper with every line read. The very foundation upon which the HOA had built their tyranny crumbled in plain sight. Yet Marina did not stop there. She unveiled video recordings, testimonies from former members who had defected, and digital archives that captured the scheming conversations of the HOA's leadership. The lies that had been whispered in secret halls now echoed in the open air, every deceitful word stripping away the mask of legitimacy. One by one, the people turned their gaze toward the trembling faces of the HOA leaders, no longer symbols of power but silhouettes of disgrace. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, a silence that pressed upon every soul present. It was the silence before a storm of reckoning. Finally, a voice rose from the crowd, trembling with anger but strengthened by truth. "You deceived us. Another voice followed, louder, more resolute, "You used us." Soon the chorus grew, a wave of fury breaking through years of fear. The HOA leaders, once feared as untouchable rulers, shrank beneath the storm of their neighbors' wrath, their authority dissolved like salt in rain. Marina raised her hand, her calm presence anchoring the chaos. "Justice is not vengeance," she reminded them, her voice carrying both strength and grace. "We will not become like them. But we will reclaim what was always ours." The people nodded, their fury tempered by her wisdom. In that moment, a shift occurred, not just in power but in the very spirit of the community. Where once there had been hesitation, there was now unity. Where once there had been silence, there was now a chorus of defiance. The HOA representatives attempted one final plea, their words desperate, promising reform, negotiation, compromise. But the people had tasted truth, and once tasted, it could never again be forgotten. Marina stood unyielding, her eyes unwavering. "You have had your chance," she said firmly. "And you chose greed. Now you will answer to the people you tried to control." With that, the community voted then and there, voices raised not in fear but in solidarity, declaring the HOA dissolved, their power revoked, their grip forever broken. The decision thundered through the gathering like a victorious drumbeat. Yet even in victory, Marina knew this was not the end but a beginning. Freedom was not simply granted. It was guarded, nurtured, and defended. And though the false rulers had fallen, the community's true work had just begun. As night descended and lanterns lit the lake with a golden glow, the people celebrated not just the downfall of the HOA but the rebirth of their unity. Children laughed freely, elders spoke of new hopes, and neighbors embraced as though seeing one another for the first time. Amid the joy, Marina stood slightly apart, gazing across the waters with quiet reflection. She understood the weight of leadership, the fragility of peace, and the endless vigilance required to protect both. Yet as she watched the people she had fought for, her heart swelled with a fierce pride. The revelation had set them free, but it was their courage that would carry them forward. And so, with stars reflected upon the surface of the lake, the town stepped into a new chapter, wiser, stronger, and bound not by false rules but by the unbreakable threads of truth and trust. The chaos of the HOA had finally settled. But the storm of emotions inside our home still lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Karen had been silenced, the community had seen her true colors, and justice had been served in a way none of us expected. Yet, the greatest transformation wasn't in Karen's downfall or in the HOA's collapse. It was within us as a family. My son, once shy and withdrawn, had emerged as a confident problem solver who dared to stand against injustice with nothing more than his wit and a laptop. My wife, who had endured stress and sleepless nights fearing Karen's next move, now carried herself with a calm pride, knowing we had survived something that could have broken us. And me, I had learned that strength wasn't just about standing tall in front of enemies but about trusting the people you love and letting them shine when their time comes. Life after the storm was quieter, almost surreal. The HOA board disbanded, many neighbors expressed regret for ever siding with Karen, and those who once feared her now avoided her like a bad memory. Karen, stripped of her influence, walked around the neighborhood with bitterness written across her face. She still lived there, but her power was gone. She was just another resident now, no different from anyone else except for the fact that no one listened to her rants anymore. My son's victory in exposing her corruption had spread like wildfire, not only in the community but online as well. The recording of her screaming when the Wi-Fi was cut, her panicked threats, and the moment she realized the police had nothing against us had gone viral. 4 days, strangers sent us messages praising my son for teaching a bully a lesson without violence or anger. Smartest kid of the year, some comments read. Karen got out Karen'd, others joked. But for us, beyond the viral fame, it was simply a moment of redemption, a moment that reminded us that no matter how powerful someone may seem, truth and unity can break their grip. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, my son turned to me and asked, "Dad, do you think Karen will ever change?" I paused, considering the question. "Maybe," I said slowly. "But people like her often thrive on control. When they lose it, they either learn humility or sink deeper into their bitterness. The choice is hers." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, but I could see the wisdom in his young eyes, a maturity that hadn't been there before this ordeal. My wife reached over, squeezing his hand, and whispered, "You taught all of us something, sweetheart, that courage isn't always about shouting louder. Sometimes it's about being smarter." That night, for the first time in months, we slept without fear of waking up to another notice taped to our door, another fine, another demand. The house felt different, as if it had finally exhaled after holding its breath through the chaos. Freedom, peace, and belonging had returned. Yet Karen's downfall had one last twist to it. Weeks later, we learned that she had been reported to city officials for her misuse of HOA funds. Investigations revealed she had been funneling money into personal expenses, from spa trips to overpriced decorations for her own property. The irony was poetic. The woman who once threatened to ruin us financially now faced heavy fines and possible legal action. We didn't celebrate her suffering, but we couldn't deny the sense of justice it brought. Life moved on, and so did we. My son's story became one we told with pride, not as a tale of conflict but as a lesson about resilience and wit. Neighbors who once feared Karen now looked up to him, asking for his help with their tech troubles, calling him the Wi-Fi hero. He would blush but smile, his confidence growing each day. And as for me, I often reflected on how close we came to giving in, to paying Karen just to keep the peace, to letting her dictate our lives. If we had surrendered, we would have lost far more than money, we would have lost our dignity. But standing together, trusting in each other's strengths, we proved that even the most powerful bully could be undone. The final lesson wasn't about defeating Karen, it was about discovering who we were when pushed to the edge. We were stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. The HOA's tyranny was gone, but the bond it forged in our family remained unshakable. And that, more than anything, was the victory we would carry forward for the rest of our lives. The end.